Today, almost everyone, regardless of religion, knows the gospel story about Jesus Christ. The time of his life on earth is not only the era of the birth of a new religion, it is a new starting point in the chronology of mankind. In most countries, it is customary to keep the chronology from the birth of Christ. No one doubts that 2,000 years have passed since this most important event for mankind. But why are people so sure of this? In our film, we will talk about the fact that the generally accepted date of the birth of Christ apparently is erroneous. This conclusion was reached by the authors of the New Chronology Project Anatoly Fomenko and Gleb Nosovsky. To study ancient documents, they used their own mathematical, statistical, and astronomical dating methods and found out that the true chronology of human development is much shorter than the generally accepted one. This means that most of the historical events happened much later than we used to think, including the birth of Christ. Let's say right away that we will not touch on issues of faith and, of course, we will not discuss the teachings of the Church. The purpose of this film is to tell about issues of a historical and chronological nature. We are scientists, and we have always emphasized and keep emphasizing in our books that our research does not concern any issues of a theological nature. We do not touch upon the foundations of the doctrine of either Christianity or any other denomination. This is a purely scientific question, a matter of calculating dates. The question of calculating dates is a matter of applied mathematics. Our research does not concern and does not affect the feelings of believers of any of the confessions. So, let's try to figure out when Jesus Christ actually lived. Once chronologists decided to divide the history of mankind into two eras, before the birth of Christ and after. Scientists call these periods before the Common Era and the Common Era. Actually, the Common Era did begin with the birth of Jesus Christ. Oddly enough, the idea of the date of the nativity of Christ finally took shape only in the middle of the 16th century during the Gregorian calendar reform. That is, 1,500 years after the Gospel events. It is surprising that neither then in the 16th century, nor now, for some reason, almost no one doubts the accuracy of the established date. It is generally accepted that for the first time the date of the nativity of Christ was calculated by the monk Dionysius Exiguus, Denis the Little. It happened, allegedly, in 532 AD. That is, 500 years after the event itself. Moreover, Dionysius first calculated the date of the crucifixion of Christ, and only then, relying on the traditional idea of the age of Christ at the time of execution and his own calculations, Dionysius determined the year of the birth of the Savior. Dionysius made his calculations using the method of calculating the dates of Easter accepted in his time, and in doing so made serious mistakes. If Dionysius knew modern astronomy, then he could not have indicated the year of the birth of Christ at the beginning of the Common Era. Unfortunately, astronomical science became sufficiently developed only in the 17th and 18th centuries. But by this time, the erroneous date had already been canonized first by the Roman Catholic, and then by the Orthodox Church. Historians do not like to talk about this topic and, as a rule, refer everyone to historical documents. But for some reason they are silent about one interesting feature of ancient documents. In the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries, dates were written differently than today. In the Middle Ages, two forms of recording the name of the Savior were common. The letter I, the first letter of the name Jesus, and the letter X, the first letter of the name Christ. And when it was necessary to write, for example, the year 300 from the birth of Christ, they wrote I 300, that is, the year 300 from Jesus. And in order to record the 3rd century from the birth of Christ, they wrote the X3, that is, the 3rd century from Christ. A good example is the printer's device of Ludwig Elsevier, allegedly dated 1595. The date 1524 on the engraving by Albrecht Dürer is also indicative. We see that the first letter is not only separated by a dot from the remaining numbers, but is also quite frankly written as a Latin I with a dot. In other words, like the first letter of the name Jesus. And this is a Russian naval chart made during the reign of Empress Elizabeth Petrovna. That is, in the middle of the 18th century. The map clearly says, Kronstadt, a sea map punctual, described and measured by the decree of Her Imperial Majesty in 740 by Captain Nagaev, composed in 750. The numbers 740 and 750 are written even without the letter I. But 750 is the 8th, not the 18th century. And there are many such examples. Most likely, the Latin letters I began to be interpreted as 1,000, and the letter X as 10 not earlier than the end of the 16th century. And thus, the history of mankind has been made longer for a whole 1,000 years. But ancient documents contain other more important information. It turns out that in the old text you can find direct dates of the gospel events. These dates are contained, for example, in the old Russian Palea from the Rumyantsev collection of the Russian State Library. Palea is an old church book that has already gone out of circulation. But until the 17th century, it was used by Russian readers as replacement of the Old Testament. Palea also told about the events of the New Testament, and sometimes even supplementing the Gospel. Palea is significantly different from the canon of the Old Testament familiar nowadays. It was not just a version of the Bible, but a completely independent book. But it covered the same events as the modern canonical Bible. In Palea, all three dates are spelled out: the birth, baptism, and the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. These dates are written in two ways. The first is the well-known chronological method according to the Byzantine era from Adam. And the second is the old indication method that has already gone out of use. It turned out that these dates, written in two different ways, do not agree, although they should match. Let's see what these ways of writing dates look like. In the chronology from Adam, a year is written as a single number. This is, as it were, one almost endless counter of time. We use the same counter today, only the starting point is different from the birth of Christ. Now consider the indication method of writing dates. This method was widely used in Old Chronicles. In the indication chronology, the year wasn't written by one number, as it is today, but by three, each of which varied within certain limits. Each of the three numbers had its own name: indication, solar cycle, and lunar cycle. Each of them increased annually by one. But as soon as it reached its own limit, it was reset to one. And then again every year increased by one. Thus, instead of one, in principle, an infinite counter of years, in the indication method 3 finite cyclic counters were used. They set the year as a trio of small numbers, each of which could not go beyond the given limits. These were indication, which varied from 1 to 15, solar cycle, which varied from 1 to 28, lunar cycle, which varied from 1 to 19. The limiters 15, 28, and 19 participating in the indication chronology are coprime. That is, they have no common divisors. Therefore, any combination of them is repeated only after a number of years equal to the product of these numbers. 15 multiplied by 28, multiplied by 19, equals 7980. Thus, the repetition of the indication date occurs only after 7980 years. In other words, over a period of time of almost 8,000 years, the indication method sets the year quite unambiguously. Let's go back to Palea. Regarding the nativity of Christ, it says, "In the year 5500, be born in the flesh, the eternal King, the Lord our God Jesus Christ, on December 25th. The year 5500 is indicated here. This is the date according to the Byzantine era from Adam. And the same year, written in an indication method. Solar cycle was 13, lunar cycle 10, indication 15, on Sunday at the 7th hour of the day. But the year 5500 in the indication technique should be indication 10, solar cycle 12, lunar cycle 9. We see similar discrepancies with the dates of baptism and crucifixion. In fact, scribes could easily correct such dates and bring them in line with each other. So how could this have happened? Fomenko and Nosovsky suggested that the chronologist scribe simply could not correct the old dates recorded in the indication way, because he no longer understood this archaic chronology system. Scribes and editors began to enter dates for the Byzantine era from Adam in the annals in the 16th to 18th centuries. But in the ancient primary sources themselves, which they copied or edited, dates from Adam, as a rule, were absent. Instead, there were archaic indication dates. Trying to keep the original indication dates, the scribes could spoil them, not fully understanding the meaning of these dates. For example, they confused lunar cycle and the lunar age, which is not at all the same thing, which could give an error for many years. Scientists have found that in addition to random errors, there could have been systematic errors, that is, repetitive and associated with misunderstanding of a particular circumstance. These errors could appear for two main reasons. The first reason, initial misalignment between the points of change of 3 cycles during the year. For example, for the indication it is important when, in what month the new year begins. The September start of the year, that is, September 1st, is considered to be of Byzantine origin. In the old days, there was also a June or Egyptian beginning of the new year, time to coincide with the beginning of the harvest. The start of elections in March and January also could not be ruled out. The second reason, the old way of counting solar cycles according to the so-called dominical letters on the fingers. Tables for indicating solar cycles and lunar cycles were depicted in the form of two human hands. One of them, the left one, belonged to solar cycles and was called the dominical hand. Solar cycle was recorded on the joints of four fingers from index to little finger. Today, on the dominical hand, solar cycles increase from left to right, from the index finger to the little finger. But in ancient times, most likely, they wrote from right to left, as the Arabs still do. It turned out that this was exactly what the later scribes did not take into account, who entered the indication dates corresponding to dates from Adam. It was this systematic error that was discovered by Fomenko and Nosovsky. Considering that in Paleo there are 3 dates at a time, nativity, baptism and crucifixion, there is hope to correct these errors and restore the original old dates. To solve this difficult problem, Fomenko and Nosovsky created a special computer program. Having carried out rather complex calculations that were simply inaccessible to the editors of the 17th to 18th centuries, Fomenko and Nosovsky obtained several possible dates for the birth of Christ. 3 of them were the most likely. 87 AD, 867 AD, and 1152 AD. The remaining calculated dates were either BC or already in the 20th century. But which of these dates is correct? To determine this, it was necessary to check the dates of baptism and crucifixion. In fact, all 3 dates must be located with a certain time interval. According to Christian tradition, 30 years have passed between the birth of Christ and his baptism, and 33 years between his birth and his crucifixion. Fomenko and Nosovsky considered all possible options and determined that there are only 2 solutions that exactly match the gospel description. Of the 2, they chose the solution that is confirmed by other studies. The solution turned out to be as follows. The birth December 1152. For baptism January 1182 and for the crucifixion March 1185. That is, the time of the Jesus Christ's life on earth is the 12th century of the Common Era, and these dates are found not only in Russian documents. The date of the birth of Christ, unexpected for traditional history, can be found not only in ancient Russian documents, but also in European ones. Let us turn, for example, to a very interesting historical document that describes world history from the creation of the world to 1680. This document is called Theatrum Historicum.
Использовано в его старом значении. Обзор или обозрение.
It was written in Latin by Wilhelm Straatman, Bishop of Osnabrück, in the 17th century. In 1720, at the behest of Peter the Great, this book was translated into Russian by Gavril Bazinski, Bishop of Ryazan and Murom. And in May 1749, Theatrum was banned by decree of Empress Elizabeth Petrovna. Almost all of its copies were seized. This book talks about the celebration of Christian jubilees, which were celebrated in the Vatican from the 13th to the 16th century. Today we call this book the Lutheran chronograph because it is written from a strongly pronounced Lutheran point of view and describes the whole world history as a prehistory of the Lutherans. It ends with the year 1680, and there the jubilees are discussed in great detail. And from there you can also extract the dating of the nativity of Christ. Well, by calculation it can be proved that these anniversaries point to the middle of the 12th century. Anniversary is the celebration of the nativity of Christ, although not annually, but after a certain number of years. In what years these anniversaries were to be celebrated were established by the popes. The first who determined these dates was Pope Urban VI. In 1389, he established celebration of anniversaries every 30 years. And the first such celebration took place a year later in 1390. However, Pope Boniface IX ordered that anniversaries be celebrated not every 30 years, but every 10. This rule was observed in the Vatican until 1450. But since 1450, at the behest of Pope Nicholas V, anniversaries began to be celebrated every 50 years. All this, at first glance, boring information, actually could be the year of the birth of Christ, according to medieval popes. If in 1390 the anniversary was celebrated as a 30th anniversary, that is, a multiple of 30 years, and in 1450 as a 50th anniversary, that is, a multiple of 50 years, then the following dates are obtained: 1300, 1150, 1000, 850, and so on with an interval 150 years into the past. It is striking that the resulting list does not contain the very first year of the Common Era, where historians place the nativity of Christ. It turns out that, unlike the chroniclers of the 16th and 17th centuries, the Roman popes of the 14th century for some reason did not believe that Christ was born in the 1st century AD. But the most interesting thing is that among the obtained dates there is year 1150. And this is a date that almost completely coincides with the date from Russian Palea. Of course, in order to recognize the 12th century as the time of the birth of Christ, just 2 old documents are not enough. But there are other confirmations of this date. For example, astronomy. Two striking astronomical phenomena are associated with the period of the Jesus Christ's life on Earth. One of them is a total solar eclipse on the day of Christ's death. We will talk about this in the next part of our film. Another phenomenon is a new star, nova explosion in the year of the birth of the Savior. In the Gospel, this event is described as the appearance of the Star of Bethlehem. Now when Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea in the days of Herod the king, behold, there came wise men from the east to Jerusalem, saying, Where is he that is born King of the Jews? For we have seen his star in the east, and are come to worship him. A nova explosion is an explosion in space, as a result of which star remnants scatter in different directions, sometimes forming clusters and nebulae. One of these explosions left behind a nebula in the constellation of Taurus, which is called the Crab Nebula. For a long time it was believed that the explosion of a star in the constellation Taurus occurred in 1054. This date was indicated in ancient chronicles. Interest in the Crab Nebula arose at the end of the 19th century. In 1899, its first photograph was taken. In the 20th century, scientists Lamplan, Duncan, Bada, Trimble, Beekov, Murray, Nugent seriously studied the nebula. And it turned out that the date indicated in the annals, 1054, is incorrect, because astronomers were able to establish the exact time of formation of the Crab Nebula. How was it done? In photographs of the emission spectrum of atomic hydrogen, this nebula resembles a crab. Although in the visible spectrum it is just nebulous matter, like a cloud. But in this cloud there are very bright hydrogen emission lines. They are crimson in color, and astronomers have measured the expansion rate of this nebula in its individual sections. These data can be used to calculate the age of this nebula or the date of the explosion. During the explosion, the remnants of the star scatter in a radial direction. During the first few thousand years, the speed of expansion of the remnants of the star can be considered uniform, since space is vacuum that offers almost no resistance. This is confirmed by photographs of the Crab Nebula taken in different times. For example, the very first photograph of 1899, a photograph of 1973, and a photograph taken in 2000. One can speak only of the gradual deceleration of the flying fragments, but not of their acceleration. Modern instruments allow quickly and accurately calculating the date of the explosion. The speed of fragments and the distance over which they managed to fly off are measured. Then the distance is divided by the speed and the time of expansion is obtained. The resulting number of years is counted back. And here it is, the date of the explosion. The results obtained by different scientists are on the same time interval from 1110 to 1170. This means that the ancient chroniclers were wrong and a supernova explosion, which resulted in the formation of the Crab Nebula, occurred in the 12th century AD. At the same time interval is the date of the Nativity of Christ, discovered by Fomenko and Nosovsky in the Russian Palea and Theatrum 1150 to 1152. So, most likely, this was the same Star of Bethlehem. The fact that the star flared up in the middle of the 12th century is indicated by another astronomical fact. The Gospel says that the star was not just burning, but moving, leading the Magi to the birthplace of Jesus. The star, which they saw in the east, went before them, till it came and stood over where the young child was. But this description resembles the movement of a comet. In general, the appearance of a comet is rather unusual phenomenon. As a rule, comets appear in the morning or evening hours. Their gigantic tails stretch halfway across the sky. Such a phenomenon cannot go unnoticed by mankind. If a comet is indeed described in the Gospel of Matthew, then it is not surprising that in many old images of the Nativity of Christ, the Star of Bethlehem is shown with an obvious tail. For example, in Giotto's painting, The Adoration of the Magi, you can see that the tail of this star is stretched to the left and up. So, most likely, the artist painted exactly a comet, and not just a star, the beam of which points to the baby Christ. Or in the painting, The Birth of Christ, by the medieval painter Albrecht Altdorfer. And here is the image on the altar, created allegedly in the 16th century by Albrecht Dürer. There are obviously two luminaries above the Magi, a star and a kind of luminous elongated ball with an angel inside. Probably in the year of the birth of Christ, in addition to the explosion of a new star, people also saw the famous Halley's Comet. These astronomical phenomena were so spectacular that they could well merge in the minds of people into a single event. Is it possible to calculate whether Halley's Comet appeared around 1152? The orbital period of the Halley's Comet is 76 years. Therefore, it is possible to calculate with high accuracy all the dates of its appearance over several thousand years. The last time Halley's Comet was observed in 1986. We subtract 11 times 76 from 1986 and get 1150. This means that both the Star of Bethlehem and Halley's Comet really appeared almost simultaneously. From ancient times, other astronomical confirmations of the exact dates of the Nativity and the crucifixion of Christ have come down to us. They were left by ancient and medieval astronomers. They recorded these dates in the form of horoscopes. Today, many mistakenly think that horoscopes are associated exclusively with astrology, astromancy, and fortune-telling. It's worth noting that all these predictions are far from science. In astronomy, a horoscope is the arrangement of the planets and the zodiac constellations. There are 12 zodiac constellations. Today their names are well known. These are Aries, Taurus, Gemini, and so on. The planets constantly change positions in the sky relative to the fixed stars, which reminds a giant clock calendar. This celestial calendar has long been used by people to record the dates of especially important events. Anatoly Fomenko and Gleb Nosovsky deciphered dozens of ancient zodiacs. Among them there are two zodiacs which encrypt the dates associated with Jesus Christ. In 1826, the book, Astrology, by the English physician and astrologer Ebenezer Sibley was published in London. This book contains a drawing depicting the zodiac with a horoscope for the date of the birth of Jesus Christ. This is evidenced by the inscription made in the middle of the drawing, as well as the image of the Nativity of the Savior, placed at the bottom of the page. Anatoly Fomenko and Gleb Nosovsky decided to check what date is written in this zodiac. Does it correspond to the generally accepted date of the Nativity of Christ? With the help of the Horus computer program, they carried out all the necessary calculations and found out that this horoscope has only one correct solution. The date recorded by an unknown astronomer is December 25th, 1151. No wonder this zodiac is still considered heretical. This unique zodiac, recognized as incorrect by traditional history, is in fact another independent confirmation of the date of the Nativity of Christ, calculated by Fomenko and Nosovsky. It turns out that the correct dating of the date of Christ's birth can still be found in old books, despite the centuries-old efforts of historians of the Scaligerrian school, who destroyed more than 1,000 incorrect books. In Egypt, Fomenko and Nosovsky discovered another date associated with Jesus Christ. The fact is that the authors of the new chronology have studied the artifacts of ancient Egypt for many years. They were particularly interested in the zodiacs that adorned the vaults of many Egyptian tombs and temples. When deciphering the Egyptian zodiacs, it turned out that all the recorded dates belonged to the period from the 11th to the 15th century AD. and among them there is one in which the exact date of the crucifixion of Jesus Christ is recorded. We are talking about the famous round dendra zodiac, or as it is also called the zodiac of Osiris. This is a huge image, a bas-relief in stone. It depicts the zodiac, shows constellations and location of the planets in it. Its symbolism is well known to us from the texts of the Middle Ages. And we dated this zodiac, elaborating the studies of previous scientists, in particular, Nikolai Morozov, who was the first to raise the question that the date, attributed by modern historians and astronomers to the zodiac, is incorrect. If one dates the zodiac regardless of its supposed a priori dating, which we did, then a completely different date is obtained, namely, 1185, the end of the 12th century 1885. But there is one contradiction in the Gospels. They say that on the day of the execution of Christ there was a solar eclipse. Both astronomers and historians are well aware that if such a vivid astronomical phenomenon as a solar eclipse is mentioned in the annals, then the date of the described event can be established with high accuracy. But the fact is that on the day of the crucifixion, minds of people, and ended up on the pages of the Bible as events that took place simultaneously. But why do the authors of the new chronology believe that the date encoded in the round dendra zodiac is directly related to Christ? We, and not only us, have written a lot about the fact that Osiris and Christ is the same person. We are not the first to say this. The association between them is so stunning that it has been noticed for a long time. Therefore, if a certain date is written on the zodiac of Osiris, then it is naturally associated with Christ. Therefore, we use the dating of the zodiac of Osiris in connection with Christ. And just like the Russian Palea, the ancient Egyptian round dendra zodiac indicates 1185 as the date of the crucifixion of Christ. But not only astronomical calculations and ancient chronicles indicate that Jesus Christ lived precisely in the 12th century AD. There is another confirmation of this. Unfortunately, few material evidence of the gospel events has survived to this day. One of them is the Holy Shroud. This is a 4-meter-long linen cloth, in which, according to legend, Joseph of Arimathea wrapped the body of Jesus Christ after his crucifixion and death. Since 1578, the shroud has been kept in a special shrine in the Cathedral of St. John the Baptist in Turin. Therefore, today it is known as the Shroud of Turin. According to the traditional version of history, this relic was first revealed to the people in 1353 in the French town of Liry. Almost 2 centuries later it came to Turin, and 100 years later it was placed in the chapel of the Turin Cathedral. At the same time, a special case was made in the cathedral to store the shroud. In this case, the shrine had lain quietly almost until the end of the 19th century, until it was decided to photograph it for the first time. In 1898, on behalf of the church authorities, the photographer Secondo Pia took the first photographs of the shrine, and something incredible was discovered. On the negative, suddenly a clear positive image of a human body appeared, front and back. It became obvious that the shroud kept a mysterious imprint. If you look at the fabric in normal lighting, it is barely noticeable, but the negative turned out to have a fairly clear image. Even the smallest details were visible. The results of the study rejected assumption that this image was simply applied to the fabric in some ingenious way. It was clear that the very structure of the tissue had been changed, and the drops of blood were real, and they got on the tissue even before the image had appeared. There was no doubt whose imprint it might be. The Shroud of Turin contained an image of the body of Jesus Christ. Nevertheless, scientists decided to clarify the age of the shrine. In 1988, it was decided to determine the age of the tissue by radiocarbon dating. A small piece 10 millimeters wide and 70 millimeters long was cut off from the Holy Shroud. It was divided into 3 parts, which were sent for research to the best radiocarbon laboratories in the world. Arizona State University in the USA, the University of Oxford in the UK, and Swiss Federal Institute of Technology in Zurich. Scientists examined these fragments independently of each other. The result of the study was sensational. In this case, the obtained date caused big shock to the scientific community and general public at the time when it was made public. It turned out that this was by no means the 1st century AD, as it was assumed a priori, but somewhere just the 12th century AD, plus or minus 50 or 100 years maximum. This dating fits perfectly with our results, with dating the life of Christ in the 12th century AD. Experts tend to believe that the most accurate were the findings of the Oxford laboratory. British scientists have indicated the shortest dating interval from 1090 to 1265. Moreover, some articles even named the year by which the Shroud of Turin was accurately dated, 1150. Naturally, this option does not suit historians. No one wants to admit that the time of manufacture of this canvas is the 12th century. Many scientists still stubbornly call the shroud a forgery. They are rather ready to admit that it was not made in the 12th, but in the 14th century, and made precisely as a counterfeit to fool the people. After all, according to the official version, it was in the 14th century that it was put on display for the first time. But the shroud was known long before its demonstration in Liri. Where was it until the middle of the 14th century? It is believed that until the beginning of the 13th century, the Holy Shroud was kept in the Church of Saint Sophia in Constantinople. It means that it was brought to Europe from the East. However, there is no mention of it in the Eastern Orthodox practice. But in the East there is another very revered shrine, the Savior not made by hands, or Edessa. There are Orthodox icons dedicated to Edessa and a great feast in Holy Week in its honor as well. Another name of this Savior is Ubris. In Old Russian, the word ubris meant a scarf or a long, wide piece of cloth. In general, the same as the shroud. Therefore, many researchers have long come to conclusion that the European shroud and the Russian Savior not made by hands is the same object. But why then is the imprint of the whole body visible on the Shroud of Turin, and on the Ubris only the holy face? In historical documents, one can find the Greek name of the Savior not made by hands, tetradiplon, which means folded in four. Most likely, the Shroud of Turin was kept folded for a long time so that only the holy face was visible, and it was kept in Russia. That is why this shrine is so respected among us and unknown in the West. Most likely, the shrine was taken out of Russia during the time of troubles, when Russia was defeated and plundered by foreign troops. That is, not earlier than the 17th century. But what about display of the shroud in the 14th century in Liri? No one knows exactly what was shown to the people back then. It is possible that this was just a forgery, because the case for the shroud was made only in 1678. Of course, the radiocarbon dating method is still imperfect. There are cases when the dates obtained by this method were erroneous. However, to date, radiocarbon analysis is considered the most accurate method for determining the age of biological objects. Of course, if during the study, scientists comply with all the necessary requirements and can be fairly objective. And the only dating of the shroud obtained by radiocarbon analysis is the 12th to 14th centuries. After 1988, no one carried out a subsequent analysis of the shroud. This is a rare case where we are dealing with more than just an answer. That's when they say, the radiocarbon date of this sample is such, and that's it, and goodbye. What results of measurement were obtained, how they calibrated, nothing is said. But in this case, we have the initial measured data, that is, they were measured in a few laboratories. And here are these initial, so-called raw radiocarbon dates, which have not yet been calibrated, just measured, they were published, they are known. In this case, the radiocarbon method indeed was able to provide an answer, with a certain accuracy, but a reasonable answer. So, the results of research of Anatoly Fomenko and Gleb Nosovsky indicate that the true era of the Jesus Christ's life on earth is the 12th century AD. This is indicated by ancient documents and astronomical dates, and the results of radiocarbon analysis of the Holy Shroud. And this means that in the 16th century, historians either made a mistake or deliberately pushed the date of Christ's birth many years back into the past. As a result, the chronology of human progress has become longer by more than 1,000 years. Perhaps that is why the so-called mystery of the Dark Ages of the Middle Ages appeared in history. Until now, scientists have not been able to give a simple logical, let alone scientific, explanation. Why are so few medieval objects of material culture preserved to this day, and there are so many antique artifacts? But logically it should be the other way around. The only explanation given by historians sounds unconvincing. They invite us to seriously believe that after centuries of rapid development, the ancient civilizations of Europe and Asia suddenly degraded and fell into decay. All the scientific and cultural achievements of antiquity were forgotten, and for 10 centuries people were in the darkness of ignorance. Once brilliant Latin turns into a crude primitive language, art disappears, coinage is abolished in many lands, and in general, glimpses of intellectual work, especially in the early Middle Ages, are accidental and, one might say, single phenomenon. And allegedly only in the 15th to 16th centuries during the Renaissance, people suddenly remembered all the discoveries and achievements of their early ancestors and not only began to use, but also improve them. The new exact date of the birth of Jesus Christ puts everything in its place, and it becomes obvious that in history there has not been almost 1,000 years of backwardness and ignorance. There has not been a gap in historical epochs. There were no sudden ups and downs in the cultural development of mankind. On the contrary, it developed fairly evenly and consistently. We are well aware that the new chronology is sometimes perceived as a kind of unnecessarily revolutionary upheaval in our understanding of the past, and moreover, in our self-consciousness today. No need to be afraid of this. There have been such examples in the history of science, and they have always led to a new and more correct view of the world. For example, the story of the discovery of Tycho Brahe and Copernicus. They stated that it is not the sun that revolves around the earth, but rather the earth revolves around the sun. You may remember the controversy that arose at that time, the shock in society after this discovery. But nothing sinister, people realized that this view is more correct and corresponds to our ideas about the universe. But in general, the life of mankind does not get worse from scientific discoveries. Experience shows that the more discoveries, the better we live. At least not worse. And you can, of course, argue with this, but it's hard to argue with the fact that a scientific discovery cannot be suppressed. And many are trying to suppress the discovery of Fomenko and Nosovsky. Every year the struggle against the new chronology becomes more and more stubborn. Recently, a deliberate distortion of the main ideas of the new chronology has been carried out on a large scale. Outwardly solid academic publications present the ideas of Fomenko and Nosovsky in a deliberately caricatured form. The fact is that history is a complex subject, and this type of revolution that we know, such examples of striking revolutionary upheavals, as we have already said, in astronomy, physics, and mathematics have already occurred before. Here in history, this event came later. There is a lot of material here. It was necessary to comprehend a lot, to process a lot. But in our opinion, this will only lead to a more correct understanding of our history. This is very important, including for us, for a better understanding of modernity. In fact, misrepresentation of history is far from being harmless. From time to time it affects both political decisions and many decisions in our lives. Because people, including politicians, including the leadership of different countries, they sincerely believe in this false picture. Well, in some cases, respective decisions are made based, among other things, on this picture. And a decision made on a false basis is a false decision, and it can lead, and has led to the most difficult consequences. If 400 years ago the chroniclers made a mistake in determining the date of such an important event for mankind as the Nativity of Christ, perhaps they incorrectly indicated the place of his life on earth, where in fact Jesus was born, where his crucifixion and miraculous resurrection took place. We will tell about this in our next film, Forgotten Jerusalem.